Call it?
Call it.
Yes. I can't call it for you. Well, it wouldn't be fair.
I didn't put nothing up.
Yes, you did. You've been putting it up your whole life. You just didn't know it.
Well, look, I need to know what I stand to win.
Everything.
How's that?
You stand to win everything. Call it.
Is something wrong?
With what?
With anything?
Is that what you're asking me? Is there something wrong with anything?
Heads, then.
Well done. Don't put it in your pocket.
Sir?
Don't put it in your pocket. It's your lucky quarter.
The Coen brothers' 2007 neo-noir, neo-western No Country for Old Men has long been lauded as one of the greatest films of the 21st century and one of the duo's best works to date. And regardless of what you think of its reputation, it's a film which seeps meaning ready to be soaked up by any viewer with enough time and consideration for its slow-burning and indirect thematic presentation. Of course, this is something it owes greatly to its origins in Cormac McCarthy's 2005 novel of the same name. As I see it, the overarching themes the film deals with are that of morality, determinism, and death. But there's certainly more than meets the eye. Let's dive in. The film's plot is both ever so simple and convolutedly complex. In short, we follow Llewellyn Moss, who, out hunting in the desert, comes across $2 million in the aftermath of a drug deal gone bad. A ruthless hitman, Anton Chigurh, is hired to recover the money and leaves a trail of death and destruction as he hunts him down, eventually killing Moss. And, on the sidelines, old-timer Sheriff Ed Tom attempts to solve the case, trying to keep Moss's family safe and understand what's really happening. But as the film comes to a close, Moss lies dead after being killed off-screen no less. Chigurh limps off after a car crash, and Tom sits retired and alone, the money hurled onto a riverbank now in none of their grasps. In short, it's clear the money was never the objective, but it was what it represented for each character: Moss's freedom, Chigurh's reason for chaos, and a case to secure Tom's purpose in life. Many analyses of the film have honed in on the trinity that Moss, Chigurh, and Tom form with regards to morals, be it with relation to biblical representations, Adam, the devil, and God, or more simple moral principles, neutral, bad, and good. But the morality the characters appear to enact seems to be a component of their perspective of their autonomy within the world, namely how and why things happen, and more importantly, what their agency to control those things are. Let's dive into each character to take a closer look at these three ideologies. Llewellyn Moss is our protagonist, and as such, it's logical to start with him. At the film's opening, as he comes across the aftermath of the drug deal gone wrong, Moss places his agency strongly within himself. Firstly, to safely explore the scene and deduce that danger still lurks from an inevitable last man standing. Secondly, to take the briefcase of cash as his own. And third, to return to the scene in the dead of night and offer water to a dying man. Here it's clear that Moss has some moral compass, which fluctuates somewhere between his selfish wants and needs, and an understanding that he's part of a world larger than himself. Thus, in many ways, Moss represents the primordial human consciousness. To use a Christian theological comparison, Adam. Moss cares for mankind, but when given the opportunity, cares for himself first, and thus enacts something somewhat equitable to the original sin when he snatches the briefcase filled with the greatest component of corruption: money. But with that in mind, we're immediately inclined to ask ourselves, is what he's doing right or wrong? As with the original sin, it's quite hard to define that. If we look at the act itself, taking money from the aftermath of a drug deal, it doesn't seem to be morally loaded. Moss isn't stealing from someone alive, nor someone who earned the money in the, according to contemporary legal systems, right way, and because of this, Moss remains relatively neutral. Moreover, as he's chased by Chigurh who threatens his life, Moss tends towards the notion of individual, autonomously obtained freedom rather than any predetermined outcome presented to him. For example, Chigurh presents him with an ultimatum that he will need to die, but that he could save his wife if he handed over the money. But in a very human way, Moss's response is that his wife should run while he faces off against Chigurh in order to secure both of their freedoms. And to us as an audience, this defiance in the face of mortality is wholly understandable as a human response to death. But given this is a neo-Western, Moss's defiance in the face of impending doom is relatively meaningless. But his death itself is not without meaning. Christopher Barr notes, Llewellyn had to die symbolically, so we're able to see that there's no future for mankind if we try to get ahead on our own and not as a unified species, which highlights the fact that, despite Moss's underlying moralist tendencies, without a sense of unity in the modern world he inhabits, he was doomed to fail. Something which is only exacerbated by the fact that nearly every interaction he has with non-central characters in the film is mediated by a monetary transaction, be it buying a shirt, boots, medicine, or paying a street band for help. In such a way, perhaps Moss's death was not a result of determinism or his moral compass, but the individualist reaction to the original sin itself. In a word, Chigurh is chaos. All that we know about him is that he's a hitman hired to retrieve the money, and taking that to the extreme of including by any means necessary. If we take Moss's action as the original sin, it's easy to attribute Chigurh's endless hunting down as an act of divine retribution, attributing him to some chaotic godly figure attempting to right any moral wrong. But I don't think this particularly fits, nor does the exact opposite of painting Chigurh as a devil intent on evil. Instead, through his completely unpredictable nature, it seems more fitting to evaluate Chigurh as a completely amoral character, lacking any sense or interest in the overarching binaries of right and wrong, and in doing so, he highlights the fact that morality is not binary. Again, it's easy to reduce Chigurh's coin toss to one outcome, which will be good, and the other bad, but the binary simply does not exist here, at least not for him. Neither outcome has any conscious heavy outcome for Chigurh, and is instead simply a way to allow his rampage to continue with a clean consciousness. After all, to exist in an amoral state, it is almost necessary for one to extradite oneself from the idea of agency, as, if one takes themselves as an autonomous moral agent, they're inclined to base their actions on some sort of spectrum, whether it's assigned by a pre-existing system such as religion or society, or by one's own internal moral codes. But in rejecting agency in life altogether, Chigurh is able to become a true agent of chaos, making his actions seem inconceivably jumbled and even random to onlookers who abide by any social or moral code, such as Moss or Tom. And Chigurh manages this perfectly by handing his agency to an arbitrary coin toss which serves to define what he will do, but not why he will do it. Both times that we view this coin toss in the film, it's met with confusion, but the later encounter with Carla Jean, Moss's wife, throws a spanner in the works as she refuses to call the coin toss. She exclaims,
"The coin don't have no say. It's just you."
And with that, Chigurh's system falls apart, and frustration, one of the few emotions he ever expresses, washes over his face. Needless to say, the refusal of calling the coin toss doesn't save Carla's life, but it does alter Chigurh's path. Perhaps as some karmic balancing, after finally taking responsibility to murder on his own accord, for the mundane reason of having promised the now dead Moss that he would kill his wife if he didn't receive the money, Chigurh finds himself in a car crash from which he hobbles off into the distance. Simply put, when he finally became his own agent in his immoral deeds, he paid the price for it. Despite Chigurh's near-death experience mortally crippling him, he's never caught by Ed Tom or any officer within the film's narrative. This is certainly framed as a huge failure for a seasoned sheriff, who, by the end of the film, we find retired. In our look at Ed Tom, let's focus on these final moments, where he finds himself free from the societally moral shackles of the police force, and instead finds the time to confront his dreams and explain them to his wife. One where he lost some money his father had given him, and another where he follows his father on horseback through a snowy mountain pass, and his father goes ahead to make a fire. While Chigurh and Moss both enacted moral battles for survival in a horrifically hostile world, these last moments frame Tom completely differently. Throughout the film, Tom had worked within this moralistic battle between the good cops, the bad criminals, and the people. Like Moss, caught somewhere in between, but after his retirement, these societally driven morals fall away. So, although he previously played the part of the good guy, or the good bringing godly power, he has now been reduced to absolutely nothing in this statement, lost and bewildered by the prospect that nothing lies ahead. In a conversation with a friend just before his retirement, he says,
"I always figured when I got older, God would sort of come into my life somehow. And he didn't."
But his friend Ellis points out that,
What you got ain't nothing new.
in other words, this is the fundamental human battle with trying to find meaning in the world. And this is where it becomes important that Tom discusses his dreams. Where Moss and Chigurh were autonomous and non-autonomous agents, Tom's dream world sits somewhere firmly between the two, as of course these dreams are the result of his past life and current state of mind, but at least consciously, he has no control over its contents and is simply forced to float alongside it, deciphering its meaning. As he describes himself following his father in the alpine wilderness on horseback, everything is interrupted by the classic,
Then I woke up.
which, again, sidelines his autonomy within the world. Tom, being the oldest of the bunch, is clearly facing death, and with this insurmountably complex event in front of him, he is rightfully lost and despondent. And with this theme in mind, one's encouraged to look back on the film and consider death as a motif which is heavily scrutinized. The way, at least for me, that death is most evidently identified throughout the film is through language. The film starts with Tom's monologue, which exclaims,
You can't help but compare yourself against the old timers.
seeing death as an immortalization of ideals. But as we approach the film's close, many characters note the difference between a person when they're alive and when they're dead. Chigurh, when asked if Carson Wells is with him, says,
Not in the sense that you mean.
when the man who hires Wells is also shot, his accountant stumbles over the words,
He felt.
and as Deputy Wendell talks of dead Mexicans, he struggles between saying that they are or was Mexicans, to which Tom replies,
There's a question. Whether they stopped being. And when.
and I think despite all the discussion of morality and agency, this is where the film's most profound statement lies. The fact that all our complex thoughts and ideologies are mediated by language, which in itself is a jumbled mess. A feature which is perhaps furthered by the fact that moments of Spanish dialogue within the film remain without subtitles in the English release. If language is the main component of ideology, and thus ideological battles, perhaps it's also no mistake that the three characters we discussed earlier barely share any dialogue with each other, instead interacting with each other's shadows, gunshots, or clues that they'd left behind. But maybe it's all simpler than this. The words spoken by the characters are fleeting, and regardless of whether they're one of the rambling Texans, the quiet Mexicans, or the man of few words that Moss is, they all perish one way or another, whether that be at the hands of a chaotic gunman, or, like for Tom, by the long arm of death itself. In other words, death comes to everyone, regardless of their moral compass, perceived agency, or any other facet of their being. And perhaps this is the simple core of No Country for Old Men and its thought-provoking title. Perhaps this has nothing to do with generational divides, long-standing personal ideologies, morals, or perceived agency. Perhaps there is simply no country for old men, as death inevitably comes to all. With that having been said, that's all for today, folks. Don't forget to hit subscribe and click the notification icon to stay up to date on all my content. And if there's anything else you'd like to request, please don't hesitate to ask. As always, it's been a pleasure. Nihat here with Film Comics Explained. Thanks for stopping by.